Right here. Okay, it's 6:30. Let's go ahead and get started, please. So good evening. My name is Rob Steen. I'm with the Department of Public Works. I'm joined here tonight by Dan Santos, the Director of Public Works, Griffin Bowden, the Town Engineer, Lynn Poignant, the Director of Community Services. What we're here to do tonight is have a discussion with you, and really it sort of evolves into a conversation about the wastewater plan and what the town is at least planning to do with its wastewater plan. What you'll see is the agenda behind me. We will go through this agenda, but what we have seen in the first couple presentations is that people have traditionally been more comfortable asking questions as we go versus waiting to the end. You'll find, as Lynn's been passing out acronym sheets, there's a lot to this, and a lot of this is pretty technical stuff. And if you get lost along the way, you could be lost for a while within the presentation. So I'd prefer you, if something's not making sense to you, or if you're not understanding what's being said, to ask a question at that time, and we'll have a conversation. Now, I will warn you, tonight is being filmed. So tonight is going to be rebroadcast on Channel 18. So before you ask your question, if you could just raise your hand, let Lynn come to you with a mic so that the audience will be able to hear what you have to say and what your question is, and that way we can have a back and forth that can be heard by everybody. Otherwise than that, I'll have to repeat the question, and that can get tedious for people. So, turning to the agenda, what we're going to do is, the first thing is a plan of this size and magnitude, as you can imagine, is never done by one person, even one group of people. So we want to talk briefly and acknowledge the folks that were involved in creating this. We're then going to go into a problem review and some background information. Not knowing who's in the audience, the presentation has been written for people that range from, Peter Doyle, who had to be joining us tonight, who was the wastewater superintendent and knows a whole lot about this stuff, to somebody who may not know very much at all. So we have a little bit of all of that in there. And it's for that very reason. So if you're here and if you've been following this, I apologize if some of this is rudimentary, but we want to, as part of this process, make sure everyone comes to the same level in terms of understanding as we begin this discussion. We then will get into what the needs of the town have been shown to be, potential solutions to those needs, and we'll spend some time on the different types of solutions that are available to us, how those came together for a plan. We will then, and I'll mention this a number of times, talk about the financials of that plan. Now, as a caveat to that, I am an engineer. The financials were pulled together by the finance team of the town of Barnstable, and they are very well versed in this. For in-depth information on that, they gave a presentation to town council on October 3rd. I would encourage you all, if you want good in-depth information on the financials aspect of this, to go watch that presentation. Again, it was October 3rd. Mark Milne addressed the town council, and in doing so, he answered a lot of questions. What you'll hear in that presentation and what you'll hear me talk about tonight in the portion of it that I have is that the financial plan is currently evolving. And what they're expecting is to be about a one-year conversation with town council on what is the best way to actually execute the financial plan, and decisions will come out of that. Again, we'll touch on that again when we get into the presentation, but I just want to make sure everyone understood coming into this that this presentation is basically on the technical aspects. I'll talk to the financial as I can. However, there's better sources for that. And then finally, we'll get into the implementation part in terms of how we're going to execute at least the first phase of this plan and moving forward. So, and we can do questions at the end, but again, feel free to ask as we go. So, teams. The town council in 2015 formed what's called the Water Resources Advisory Committee. And that was made up of 11 citizens, 3 of which are town councilors, 8 of which were non-political types, that worked together with DPW and other departments in the town to craft the bones of this plan. The people that were involved are seen there. And they worked with town staff, and town staff act as the technical resources and the financial resources for that committee, and they were listed here, all working together to try to formulate the plan. Other organizations were involved as well. The Department of Environmental Protection joined with us early in the process, and a number of their employees actually sat with us and sat with the RAC as the RAC was going through its planning process to try to provide input from DEP's perspective. So we've had them on board in discussing with us from the very beginning the plan and aspects of the plan and what they thought was valuable and not valuable within it. Also working with us, the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition. We will talk about them a lot tonight. They've been a great sort of public-private partnership with the town, principally working with the non-traditional items, but also with an interest in other. Association of Preserve Cape Cod worked with us. really more focused on stormwater issues, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And then finally, UMass Dartmouth, through the SMAS program, as listed on the screen, was working with us, and they have done the modeling that we will talk about and do the modeling aspects of this plan. One other point that came to be is that within the last year, the leadership of town council, and that'll be town council president and vice president, the town manager, the assistant town manager, the finance director, Dan, Griffin, myself, and anybody else that needed to plug in, legal at times, all met every Tuesday for an hour at least to sort of work through the plan and make sure that it is what was politically necessary to me moving forward. And I want to take this slide as a moment to pass on our condolences as a department to the community in whole, those from Osterville who had Jimmy as a representative, or those that were just all of Barnstable where he was the president of town council. We have recently lost Jim, and it will be a great loss to the process and to the plan. He was a titan within this process and within the planning, and we will miss him. So going back, as I talked about, to some more of the fundamentals, let's talk about the problem. So if you look across the town, there's a number of reasons why communities may engage in wastewater planning. They're listed here. The one we've heard the most about is impaired embayments. But we've also been hearing about groundwater quality, and those that live in Hyannis and are part of the Hyannis water system know that PFOS and PFOA has become an issue for them and is now starting to be something that they are having to deal with and treat at wellheads. Other issues, those that live around Lake Quaquet or are familiar with people with Lake Quaquet, you don't have to look much farther than that to understand that we're having pond issues. That can be for a number of different reasons. There's failing and expensive septic systems. When we first got into this, one of the things that we were first working on is Craigville Bathhouse and the septic system for the Craigville Bathhouse. But as we started to look into what it would cost to replace that septic system, the price of that was coming in at around $350,000 for a septic system. That's because it's in the velocity zone within the new flood mapping, and thus making it a very expensive replacement. It didn't take much to realize that that was probably not going to be tenable for all the folks that live down in that area, up and down, and that they would soon be looking for a municipal solution in that area. Economic development. Communities have traditionally used or had, for lack of a better term, Title V code as a zoning system, i.e. Title V's restricted growth in areas, both desired and undesired. So as you move forward and start looking at wastewater solutions, that can enable the community to grow in places that it wants to grow. Conversely, if you're moving forward with wastewater solutions, it may allow it to grow in places you don't want to, so you need to buttress that with appropriate zoning to make sure the community maintains the flavor that it wants to maintain going forward. New flood zones, as we talked about with Craigville Bathhouse, and then the regulatory requirements, which kind of circles back to the top with the embayments. So the county and the Cape Cod Commission championed what you've probably heard of as the 208 process. The 208 process is a Clean Water Act report that they needed to update, but that really focuses on the embayments, and principally marine embayments, and principally nitrogen to those embayments. So what you'll see is that nitrogen in a marine environment is the limiting factor to growth, i.e. everything else is present for algae to bloom or for other things to rapidly grow, with the exception of nitrogen. So if you add nitrogen to it, you will cause rapid growth there. Conversely, when we get into ponds, phosphorus does that for ponds, not nitrogen. So freshwater, phosphorus will cause rapid growth. Saltwater, marine waters, nitrogen will cause rapid growth. And where that nitrogen is coming from is listed here under the origins on the slide. This is from the 208 report itself, and the two charts that you see here basically show similar versions of the same thing. The one on the left is total nitrogen within the system, and this is specialized to Cape Cod. And though it's difficult to read on this chart, what you'll see that blue on the far right is septic load. And if you could see it, you'll see that that's about 65 to 67% of the total nitrogen on Cape Cod that's there. Now, more interestingly is the chart on the right. That is total controllable nitrogen. So that is the nitrogen that we could potentially affect. Basically, atmospheric deposition's been taken out. And what you'll see there, if you look at that, that now brings septic load to the 70 to 80% of the total controllable nitrogen on Cape Cod. It's also interesting to note that you have fertilizer at about 9% and stormwater at about 9%. So those are the three highest nitrogen contributions that we can change or in any way control going forward. So if we have to get nitrogen out of the system, and these are the ways to do it, this is how we have to focus our effort. All right, so back to the fundamentals. Let's talk about what nitrogen in a system does in a marine body. So if we have a healthy ecosystem with healthy levels of nutrients, then what you're going to have is algae growth will be limited by the lack of nitrogen. Sunlight will penetrate the water. You will have aquatic grasses, in our case eelgrass, that will grow. They'll provide habitat, they provide food, and they also create oxygen. And organisms, excuse me, are happy, healthy, and do their thing. However, if you're in an environment where you have excessive nutrients, what will happen is the water will become cloudy because algae will start to grow rapidly. That will block sunlight. The grass populations will not thrive in that situation. And additionally, as those algae start to die off, bacteria at the bottom will start to consume them. Those bacteria use oxygen as their terminal electron acceptor as they're trying to convert that organic carbon into energy and fuel. And in the process of doing that, they will start to decrease the dissolved oxygen levels within the area. The loss of habitat will come by the loss of the grasses, and then those creatures that can leave will leave, those that cannot will perish. So the regulators saw this and said, okay, we need to start to address this issue. And about a decade and a half ago to 2 decades ago, they came up with the Massachusetts Estuaries Program, where they, DEP, along with UMass Dartmouth, teamed up to sort of look at this problem. And they're looking at it on 89 estuaries across southeast Massachusetts, not just Cape Cod. What they came up with and how they proceeded with that is UMass Dartmouth came up with a land use model which takes a look at how land is utilized and then predicts how that will affect the water bodies that are associated with that land. DEP then takes the results of those studies and creates what's called a total maximum daily load. It's one of the acronyms on your sheet, TMDL. What that is effectively a budget for the water body, for nitrogen in this case. It could be for other things, but the TMDLs that we're speaking of tonight is dealing with nitrogen. So that's the nitrogen budget for that water body. Eelgrass has been used by DEP as the Sentinel Station and by MEP. So if you read their reports, you'll see they're talking about eelgrass populations, what were there in 1951 versus what's there now. And they use that as the canary in the mine to sort of indicate health of an estuarine system. And then they divided the Cape into watersheds. Now, I had a presentation not long ago where I went through the vast majority of the presentation, and afterwards a person came up to me and said, you know, all good, but what's a watershed? And I quickly realized that that wasn't good. That person didn't follow along. So I've actually thrown a slide in here to sort of talk about what watersheds are. I apologize if you already know this, but want to make sure everyone's catching this up. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, all a watershed is it's an area on the map where a drop of water in that area, either on the surface or subsurface, will go to whatever the water body that you're interested in. Maybe it's a river, maybe it's an embayment, maybe it's whatever. All that water goes to that area. And Cape Cod has been divided up by watershed. If you look at the yellow lines in the map to the right, you will see all the watersheds that are on Cape Cod. Now what you'll notice is these watersheds do not conform to any sort of geopolitical boundary that currently exists. They cross over to different towns, they cross over to different villages, sometimes there's multiple towns involved. So as you do wastewater planning, you have to think about what those other communities are doing to deal with the watershed, to deal with that embayment that you're particularly trying to work on. So this is the watershed map for the town of Barnstable. So what you'll see is Barnstable there, Barnstable Harbor's to the north, Nantucket Sound's to the south. There's 3 principal watersheds to the south side, 3 bays, Centerville River, and Lewis Bay. The Barnstable Harbor watershed has one sub-watershed aspect of it at Millway that's affected. And you'll see numbers within them. So in the blue on the left, 3 bays, there's a 60% number right there. What that tells you is that in the 3 bays watershed, to regain a healthy 3 bays ecosystem, we would need to remove, or modeling's predicting, that we have to remove, on average, 60% of the controllable nitrogen load from that watershed. For Centerville River, we need to remove 34% of the controllable nitrogen load. For Lewis Bay, 23%. For Millway, 65%. Now, Halls Creek has a plus, 57%. And what that means is Halls Creek has assimilative capacity. Halls Creek, that ecosystem could actually have more nitrogen go to it and remain healthy. So you have these three things. Now, there's some nuance that needs to be understood about this. These numbers that you're seeing here, 60%, 34%, 23%, these represent the amount of existing nitrogen that must be removed. Yes, ma'am. So Halls Creek is the mustard-colored one, orange-colored one, right there. So that is 60% of the existing nitrogen that needs removed. What's not stated but implied is then 100% of all future nitrogen has to be removed. If you've got to remove 60% of the existing, you can't have any future going into that estuarine system. So 60% of the existing, 100% of the future to get to a healthy three-base ecosystem. The same thing with Centerville River, Lewis Bay, Barnstable Harbor. Now, one other subtlety is those are averages. The reality is this, that we are actually regulated on a sub-watershed basis. And if you look at the modeling, and what the modeling has predicted, that at future loads and future flows, we will need to have these levels of removal of existing nitrogen in order to be able to achieve what we want to achieve at the Sentinel station, which is right there. So you can see, for instance, in the Centerville River watershed, that is 80% of the nitrogen in the Centerville River watershed currently now, and 100% of the nitrogen in the future needs to be removed. Over in the three bays, there's a number of hundreds, and et cetera. But again, as we talked about at the beginning, nitrogen is not the only issue that may be a reason to be looking at wastewater planning. And in fact, there's a whole list of things ranging from phosphorus in ponds, and again, we mentioned Lake Waquaket a minute ago, to contaminants of emerging concern, to PFOS and PFOA that also have to be considered as we're looking at this plan, and the committee did that. And at the end of the day, if you really think about it, what they were trying to answer and what we as a community are trying to answer is this question here, which is, where are Title V systems as they currently are configured appropriate to provide us with the environmental protection we want, and where are they not? So let's take a step into what the process of planning is. I'll go through this reasonably quickly. When you're creating a plan, you're looking at effectively 5 needs. You're looking at normal sanitary needs, and those are the things that we've traditionally always worked on with wastewater planning before nutrients became the issue. That could be poor soils, high groundwater, etc. There's also convenience and aesthetic issues. Areas where there's high groundwater and you have to mound all these systems in a way that's not palatable to the community. Or where you have to have excessive pumping of existing systems. We have protecting groundwater and water supply issues that we need to consider. And that's what we've talked about in terms of CECs and freshwater, and then nitrogen, looking at the embayments, and then phosphorus on ponds. Protecting surface waters, and then enabling desired economic growth where we want it. Again, the community may choose to have some economic growth in certain areas and need wastewater infrastructure to do that. So what a wastewater plan does is this. It is a comprehensive plan that looks town-wide at all the needs, that then looks at the solutions, the potential solutions to those needs, marries them up into a plan, and then starts to package those as capital projects. And you'll see by the end of this presentation, we've already started to do that, and those capital projects go to town council for approval. The plan's divided into 4 phases. This is very traditional in CWMPs. The first phase is needs assessment, where the community looks at itself and says, okay, what are our needs? It then looks at the potential solutions, develops the plan, the final phase of that being the environmental piece, which is the submission of environmental notification and form filing. So before we get too deep into it, I want to touch on this, that it needs to be understood by everybody that this plan, and all plans, are a snapshot in time. It is adapting and changing. So, for instance, what was presented to the town council in August of 2017 has changed and morphed over the last 2 years based on input from the political people, but also based on input from the community, and is now what it is today. And the perfect example of that is when this plan first came out, it came out as a 320-year phase plan for 60 years total. And we started presenting this around the community in a number of different places, and the feedback we started getting loud and clear was, we like the plan, we like the fact that you're getting after this issue, however, that is too long. It needs to be shortened up. And going back to that team leadership discussion that's been happening every Tuesday, that came into that group, and there's a lot of talk and a lot of debate about what should be the right answer there. And it's now landed on 3 10-year phases for a 30-year plan versus a 60-year plan. That is one of the examples of the changes, and there's been many of them that have happened since then. Other things that have happened is there's been some opportunities that have come up. Vineyard Wind, you may have heard of, is going to land in Barnstable. When that decision got made, it became apparent that there were some synergies that could happen with them, with the sewer installation. So areas that originally were not going to happen in phase 1 are now happening in phase 1 because Vineyard Wind is enabling that to happen, and there's money savings to be had by doing that, et cetera. So the big point here is to understand that this plan will always adapt as it needs to changing technologies and changing conditions. However, at the end of the day, the first bullet is the key, that we need to meet the regulatory requirements. It will never adapt off of doing that. So our needs process looked like this. The RAC, with the staff that I showed to you, got together and they came up with a tool, and Amanda Ruggiero, who used to work here in the GIS department, were the principal authors of this tool, where it looks at all those needs we talked about and sort of lays them on top of each other in a graphical way so you could visually see where certain things were required and where they were not, and what value certain technologies would have and other technologies wouldn't. What the tool found was this table here, among others. And on the left-hand side, you'll see Watershed. And again, this conversation is going to become a watershed discussion pretty quickly here, where the different watersheds are listed. You'll see the water use within that watershed, the wastewater that's generated in that watershed, and the amount of nitrogen that's created town-wide across all those watersheds. Now remember, of that within those watersheds, what needs to be removed is this much of that. So understanding that and understanding the other needs as we look through it, we came up with this. Now this is not the plan. What this is needs. What is in red are areas that need a wastewater solution for nutrient reasons, principally nitrogen. What's in blue are areas that need a wastewater solution for either pond protection or wellhead protection. Yellow are areas where economic development is desired and the town wants wastewater solutions there to facilitate growth in a way that they want to have. And then there's purple down here principally, that is other. And in that case, remember we talked about the septic system at Craigville? That's to deal with that velocity zone and things similar to that. So solutions. So the solutions tend to fall into 3 broad categories. There's traditional solutions, non-traditional solutions, and management solutions. And I'll talk about each one of them briefly here. Traditional solutions are going to be what you would probably consider pipes and pump stations and a wastewater treatment facility. It's effectively you go into the community, you collect the wastewater, you send it somewhere else. It may actually be in that community, but you send it to a treatment area, it gets treated there, and then it gets disposed of. Non-traditional solutions tend to be things not that. So dredging, aquaculture, permeareactive barriers, we'll talk about them in a minute, fertigation, alternative toilets, alternative septic systems, things not the traditional methods. And then there's management, which is really looking at zoning as we talked about, but things like fertilizer regulation, flow management, stuff of that nature. So before I go forward, I've had a number of questions on this, so I want to spend 2 slides talking science. I apologize, I'm an engineer and I'm a geek. So bear with me on this. But this is sort of how I look at wastewater treatment, and hopefully I'll help you guys think about it. So I grew up in Maine and worked on a farm as a kid, so I kind of think this way. So wastewater treatment is effectively inverse farming. So if you think about what a farm does, and particularly a farm for animals, you have animals, you're bringing animals food because you want to grow the animal. You want it either to pull your cart, you want to use its wool, you want to eat it, you want to use its milk, you want it to have eggs. There's something you want from that animal. The food is what you bring to it for the animal to thrive and succeed. And what they do is they take whatever organic matter, food, plus oxygen, and they make new cells and energy, and a bunch of other stuff. But what's really relevant to them is new cells and energy. That's farming. What wastewater treatment does is put that on its head. So what it does is it is about the food. The animals are kind of a byproduct. And why I say that is because you have a wastewater stream that has a lot of organic carbon and things of that nature in it. It has a lot of food in it. Back in the day, back in the 60s, before the EPA came through in the 70s and started really making this treat to BOD, biological oxygen demand, and TSS, total suspended solids, Lynn, I got you this time. Back in the day when that was not happening, those flows were going out to riverine systems, and there was explosive growth. Oxygen levels were getting killed in them, and they were having die-offs. So wastewater treatment plants had to adapt to be able to take on this stuff. And what happens is the bacteria and biota of a wastewater treatment plant, the animals, are there to consume the food. They're not a byproduct unto themselves. We eventually actually waste them and throw them away. But we are trying to get food gone. So again, inverse farming. Regular farming, you're bringing food to animals so the animals will grow. This one, we're having animals consume food because we want it out of the way. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now when you start to talk about nitrogen in this process, it changes it a little bit. So remember back here how we talked about this oxygen right here? And how most things, us included, utilize oxygen as a terminal electron acceptor, which is how we deal with energy and consuming food and all that stuff, and I won't bore you with the details of that. However, you can have an aerobic environment or you can have an anaerobic environment. And an anaerobic environment is where there is no oxygen. And in a no oxygen environment, the bacteria that can thrive in that environment have much less success, and they produce much less energy, and they consume much less food. So it's to their advantage to try to find an oxygenated environment. Thus, you get the one in the middle, called anoxic. So if you can create an anoxic environment, the bacteria still want oxygen. So what will happen is organic nitrogen, which is proteins, urea, things that come from us, will come out. It gets converted pretty quickly to ammonia nitrogen, and then in an oxygenated environment, it goes to nitrate and nitrite. Now at this point, if you can introduce it to an anoxic environment, again, low oxygen environment, what the bacteria will do is they will cleave off that oxygen to use it for their metabolism. Well, that leaves that nitrogen free, and it escapes as nitrogen gas. So you've effectively removed the nitrogen from the system. Now, I don't care if you're talking about an IA system in your backyard or the most fancy plant that's doing denitrification. This is what's effectively happening. You're taking ammonia and urea, converting it to nitrite, to nitrate. You then put it in an anoxic environment where the bacteria there will cleave off those oxygens to utilize those for their own processes, and the nitrogen as a byproduct escapes as gas. Does that make sense? Okay, traditional wastewater. Science geek part's done, sorry. So traditional wastewater, as we talked about, is just you go into an area, you collect the wastewater, you transport it to a treatment facility, and then you eventually dispose of it. That can happen within a community with a communal septic system, or again, can be town-wide or even larger with very large treatment plants. Because we've had questions on how you do that collective process, let me spend a minute on this slide. So what effectively happens is you have your homes here, and they, by gravity, generally, send their flow to a pipe out in the street. And by gravity, it means the pipe's pitched downhill, so water will flow down the pipe. Well, at some point in time, that comes to a low point and needs to get boosted up to the next high point to be able to flow by gravity again. And so there's something called a pump station there. And all a pump station is effectively a tank with a pump or two in it that have a float system. And as that tank fills with wastewater, it senses where it gets to a high point, turns on the pumps, pumps it up the hill to the next part of gravity, and then when it empties the tank, it shuts itself off. The pump station probably is not in the road, it's shown here. It's usually off to the side. There's a number of ways you can do those pump stations, but effectively that is the system. you try to where you can use gravity, and when you can't, you pump it up to where you can use gravity again. Make sense? Yes, ma'am. So the question was, this is the system that'll be throughout the town of Barnstable, the gravity system. We already actually have it in many parts of the town of Barnstable. So in the Hyannis area, there's already 57 miles of it with 27 pump stations there. I think, did I get 27 right? Yeah, 27 pump stations there. So it's already in place in much of it. Yes, there will be lots of this within probably about, all said and done, about a third of the community when we're all done. And I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the neighbors were not happy with it. So I was.
That's this discussion here. All right, wastewater treatment process. Now, Peter's in the room, so I feel kind of like a novice trying to do this in front of Peter. But so this is our wastewater facility. And briefly to sort of talk about how our facility works, flow comes into the front end, it goes into a headworks area, and in the headworks area, really what it does is it screens out big chunks and it settles out dirt, grit, sand, things of that nature. So it degrits it, screens out the big chunks. From there, it flows to what's called primary clarifiers. Those are very large round tanks where it can go and sit. And the reason why it does that is so that anything that can settle will settle from it. From there, it will flow into the aeration basins. Now, this is where the inverse farming happens, and this is the stuff that I kind of geek out on. This is the stuff that's interesting. In here, we maintain an oxygen level to keep the biota happy, and it consumes all the BOD that's in there. Now, from there, it flows out to two more clarifiers called secondary clarifiers that are on the backside. And those two clarifiers, what we're doing is all that bacteria and bugs that were sort of consuming all that food, we now separate them from the effluent because they all sink. They're not good swimmers. So they sink to the bottom and either get recycled back to here or wasted, depending on the age. Then it goes out, gets disinfected, and then heads out to the sand bed. So that anyone that's seen an aerial photo of our plant, notice that off to the one side is a number of sand beds. Those sand beds are used so that wastewater goes onto them and then percolates into the ground. So that is the process of the treatment plant in town. That's traditional wastewater treatment. So let's talk about non-traditional. So non-traditional can be pretty much anything but that. And there's a number of them up here, so let's talk about a couple of them. So the first one I want to talk about is up here. It's called a permeable reactive barrier. PRBs, you'll hear them referred to as the acronym. Really a very simple technology in many ways. All this is doing is this is a trench or a well that has in it an organic carbon source, often wood chips, could also be compost, could also be a vegetable oil if it's in a well type, where it is going to intercept nitrogen-rich groundwater. Now, based on the science quiz, and you guys didn't know there was a quiz to this, but now we're going to do this. If you have an area that's in a trench where there's not a lot of oxygen present, and you intercept nitrogen-rich groundwater, and there's bacteria here and organic carbons here, what's going to happen? Come on, people, we just did this. Denitrification, sir. My apologies. Yes, sir. Correct. No, I'd said previously it's got to go from urea to ammonia to nitrite to nitrate, and then I'll do nitrification. Yes. So it'll come in, the PRB would then intercept it, biota would do that, nitrogen gas would escape, and then the backside would have less nitrogen in it. There's also a buffering agent in there because it tends to acidify the soils around it where it does that. That has been shown to be a reasonably effective means of removing nitrogen for pretty much very low tech. There is problems with it on a municipal scale because you have to be able to intercept the flows, and in many cases that is a long trench, very deep, etc. However, there's places we think that this could be useful, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Other things you see here are dredging, which is effectively opening up inlets to be able to increase flushing within them. Flushing hopefully will then remove some of the nitrogen from that area. Fertigation, which is intercepting nitrogen-rich groundwater and then using it on green spaces, fields, golf courses, etc. The thought process was that because it's nitrogen rich, you could potentially utilize that versus fertilizer. So now you're not putting fertilizer into the system, you're reducing that 9% from the fertilizer we talked about a while ago, and at the same time, nitrogen is being taken up by the grasses and things of that nature as you're using it. Aquaculture. You've probably heard a number of communities talking about aquaculture. Effectively, what an aquaculture is, it's a filter feeder. It filters out the algae that's coming through. It uses that as a food source. It goes into its shells. It goes into its body. It goes into its waste. Its wastes fall to the bottom, eventually going into an anoxic zone, turning and denitrifying and turning into oxygen gas. And then the shellfish is removed from the water body, and thus the nitrogen's out of it. And then finally, alternative toilets. This one's a urine diverting toilet, which is effectively separating the liquid and the solid streams. The liquid streams initially were hypothesized to contain about 90% of the nitrogen in human waste. What they're finding now with some more experimentation is that's probably not that much. It's probably a little aggressive. However, there's still thought to, look, if you can separate the liquid and the solid streams, that liquid stream then can be dealt with separately, and then you can sort of get more nitrogen out of the system. The problem with these is to try to retrofit homes with them is difficult because they don't already have the plumbing in place to deal with all that and the tankage in place to deal with all that. Where we've thought about these is if you start thinking about areas where that liquid and solid stream are already separated. And for all the guys in the room, if you walk into most public bathrooms, there's a urinal and a sit-down. The urinal's already doing this. So if we think about it from that perspective, we might have some low-hanging fruit. Management solutions. As we talked about, fertilizer management, fertilizer is about 9%. The town has a fertilizer management program. Unfortunately, what has been found with these programs is that they're very difficult to enforce. You might remember like 4 or 5 years ago that there was an educational program put on where they were talking about Cape Cod lawns and trying to encourage people to go to Cape Cod lawns. So the ideal being they want your lawn to be brown with dandelion green tufts throughout it and not looking like what we traditionally think of as a healthy lawn. But we all know with the Cape soils that most of the time to achieve that healthy lawn, you need to lime it, you need to fertilize it, you need to do things of that nature, and you need to water it. So it hasn't gone far, and unless somebody's willing to go around and enforce on that, that is a difficult bar to be able to try to get meaningful results with. Zoning, as we talked about, is going to be necessary for a number of different ways to deal with potential growth that comes from the infrastructure that we put in. However, there's also the discussion about future. Remember we talked about it's 60% of existing, 100% of the future? Well, one of the ways you can deal with 100% of the future is you can zone it to not happen. I'm not saying the community wants to do that, but as we were thinking of solutions, it's one we had to at least consider to look at, look, you can use zoning to regulate future growth particularly. And then finally, water use, and that's really speaking to education, and an education piece to the populace to try to get them to decrease water, decrease fertilizers on their property, and sort of do the right things. That does get wrapped in. Yes, ma'am. Not at this time. Now, what town property has done is DPW has implemented an organic management program. So what we do use tends to be an organic product. However, it's still nitrogen. So we have not done that at this time. And there should be discussion, or there will be discussion, I'm assuming, about that as we go forward, but that's the case. And a lot of that comes down to what is the town's stomach for the town green not looking like the town green, or the golf courses not looking like the golf courses. There was a similar discussion recently about Roundup, though it's not a fertilizer, it's a different issue. But there's a lot of discussion from land managers about, okay, if we ban this, the results are, the aesthetics of this are going to go to this, and are we okay with that? Are we comfortable with that? So it's part of that sort of discussion that will happen. The plan. Yes, sir. Yes. So on the civilian side, no. On the town municipal side, yes, because there's a budgetary issue there too. There's no value to us to to apply more than is necessary because we have to pay for that. As a homeowner, and as other homeowners in here, I know when I'm fertilizing my lawn, for instance, I'm probably not paying as much attention to that as I should. I'm just fertilizing the lawn. It's one of the things I need to do. You know, I get on to other things to do and stuff. The town does pay more attention to that. Did you have a question, Lynn? Oh, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting about that. The question was, has anybody looked at the numbers to figure out what the optimization of fertilizer would result to? Is that a fair assessment of your question? So, there's probably, if you could find a way, the question being, is there significant opportunity in fertilizer management? If you could find a way to enforce that and regulate that, the prediction is you'd achieve about a 9% removal of nitrogen in the system. The difficult part is finding a way to enforce that and make that happen. So the plan. This is kind of a list of things that happened in order to make the plan come together. The one that we are probably most interested in at the moment is down towards the bottom, which was sending out the developed CWMP to SMAS to have them look at it with their modeling. I'm happy to say that we've gotten some initial results back from them. They've taken our plan, rerun it through all the models that they have, and feel that the plan will achieve what it's supposed to achieve and will achieve the environmental benefit that it's supposed to gain. So we're very happy to see that. As I mentioned, the plan is 3 10-year phases for 30 years total. And this is the plan. So what you are looking at is effectively the traditional solution town-wide across 3 phases. Phase 1, 0 to 10 years, is the red area. Those are the areas that will receive a traditional solution in the first 10 years of the plan. Phase 2 are the green areas. These are areas that are going to receive a traditional solution in the years 10 to 20. Phase 3 are the yellow areas. Those will receive a traditional solution in years 20 to 30. A few other colors to talk about. There's a lot of gray over here. What that gray is the existing sewer system. So that is a sewer system that's already in place, that's already in town. And then there's this purple over here. And if you look over here, you'll notice that it's categorized by stages, not phases. There's a reason for that. We wanted to decouple the Western solution from phase 1, 2, and 3 because the Western solution is predicated on a decision point where we have to decide, is the flow from there going to a treatment facility into the west of us? Current one being discussed is Joint Base Cape Cod, JBCC. JBCC has a treatment facility that's on it, has disposal capacity that's with it, and the current owner of it, the Air Force, is wanting to be rid of it. So the town has been in discussions with the Air Force and with another private entity on taking over that facility and potentially utilizing that facility for our wastewater needs. That's preliminary. Additionally, there's a group that's meeting now with the towns of Sandwich, Mashpee, Falmouth, Bourne, and us that are also looking at what other Western solutions there might be for a regional solution to the west of us. And then finally, if both of those fail, there's the option of bringing that flow back to the east. Not knowing when those decision points are going to come to a head, we decoupled the timing of this because this is in 3 projects, but those 3 projects may not start till the second phase of the big plan. So, in the Western solution, these are 3 stages. These are 3 phases. They are different timelines. Everybody kind of understand that? Okay, good. Now, something else I want to call your attention to. You'll notice these circles, these pink circles here and here. The town, this, though you're looking at, is mostly traditional solution. There's non-traditionals, and where they're going to be focused is right here and right here. Before I go on to speak specifically to what those are, I want to tell you why they're there. This will also speak to why we did 3 phases. So the Marcus Mills River runs up through this area right here. And the thought process was if we focused our non-traditional activities on that river and put those things in at risk, i.e. we're not going to DEP ahead of time saying we want X amount of credit for non-traditional Y. What we are doing is saying we will install these things. We will monitor these things. And then DEP, we will come to you with what they are actually doing. When that happens, we want the ability to eliminate some of phase 3, which is why we wanted to maintain a 3-phase plan, so we had a chance to adapt to what we are learning from the non-traditionals and apply it logically to the plan. So assuming everything went well here with the Marston's Mills River treatment systems, and we'll talk about them, then hopefully we can establish the DEP, good removals, and this watershed, which is generally contributing through that river system, it's all hydraulically connected, could then be scaled back in terms of the amount of traditional solution that needs to happen there. So just from a strategy perspective of non-traditionals, does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So let's talk about what we're really talking about here. Again, Marston's Mills River system, let's start up at the bottom of it. So Katuitt Bay dredge, starting last year, continuing to this year, going to next year, the community has been working to take and remove the tip of this sand spit that's been growing over time and sort of choking off's the wrong word, but restricting the flow into Katuitt Bay. It's been shown that if we do that, it will increase flush in Katuitt Bay and will have some beneficial effect. So last year we took the first piece of it off. We're about to start on the second piece, and then next year will be the third piece. The sand from there is moving down to this end of the spit to help strengthen or create a more robust area down there with the sand from the flame. Moving up the system, if you come up to the very top now, these are the cranberry bogs at the head end. So the head end of the Marston's Mills River system has a number of cranberry bogs up at the top of it, both active and not. There's been a lot of discussion about, since much of the flow from up there comes through those bogs, how we could utilize those bogs to our advantage in terms of a treatment system, quote unquote. This is where the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition comes in. They have been a wonderful partner with us and have been looking at this issue on the research side of it. And they've worked with EPA's Office of Research and Development, ORD, to start to try to figure out, is the best solution in a cranberry bog in this situation to make it a pond, to make it a wetland, to make it something in between, to somehow put something in the channels between them that would cause nitrogen removal and denitrification. So they're working with EPA and a number of other leading scientists from universities to sort of look at that from a research perspective and come up with the right way to do it. The other things that they're doing as we come down the river system is they're looking at, on each side of the river system, alternative septic systems. There's a number of alternative septic systems in the world that have not yet been approved by DEP. They're working with DEP to figure out the actual number of those that need to be installed for DEP to consider them regulatory acceptable, and then trying to find homeowners that would be willing to do that. Their hope is to concentrate that in this area. Now, that may not be realistic. They may have to do that other places as well. But if they can do that in that area, it's yet another reduction of nitrogen in the Marston's Mill River system. Permeable reactive barriers. We talked about earlier permeable reactive barriers and what those were with that anoxic zone, that trench with organic carbon in it and going through. One of the things that's being discussed here is these may be applicable to some very targeted areas, and particularly horse farms. What they're finding with their sampling on the Marston's Mills River system is that, in particular one horse farm, that if you sample downstream of that horse farm immediately after a rain event versus previous to the rain event, nitrogen spikes by a factor of 6. And what they're finding is that the average horse produces between 19 and 30 people's worth of urine a day, depending on the size of the horse, obviously. So if there's 10 horses there, that's somewhere on the order of 200 to 300 people that you could address. Now, nobody is trying to in any way dissuade agriculture in the town of Barnstable. That's not the point. But could you do something with PRBs in such a way that you would ring that farm with a PRB, again, a low-tech solution? You dig a trench, you put organic carbon in it, you put some buffering agent in it, you cover it up. And would it have a substantial and positive effect on the nitrogen situation? They're actively working that issue now and trying to see if that could actually come to some fruition. Coming further down the river, you come to Mill Pond. This is one we're working on. Mill Pond started as a mill pond, as it's called, probably about 300 years ago. At that time, it was 8 to 9 feet deep. It is currently about a foot deep in most places, in some places not even that. Now, a normal pond, as we talked about earlier, it's not nitrogen limited. In fact, what you'll find is lots of ponds are actually pretty successful at abating nitrogen. And traditionally, they'll remove about 50% of the nitrogen that they encounter. This pond has been measured and sampled and is moving about 10% of the nitrogen it encounters. So it's not very effective at that point. So the discussion is, look, if we could dredge that pond back to its original depths and characteristics, could we restore it to a 50% removal? And if doing so, you'd take out about 2,200 kilograms per year out of that entire system. Further down, there's Prince Cove right here, which is a small cove inlet where what we have been told is no longer really viable for aquaculture, from among other reasons that it started to really silt in, and the silts aren't appropriate. The discussion point here is, look, we want to get aquaculture into the picture. They're good filter feeders. We don't want to be predicated on them like other communities, but we certainly want to have them. What about if we dredged out Warren's Cove, installed aquaculture there, but maybe not commercial aquaculture. Maybe it's a nursery for aquaculture, where you're taking young aquaculture and growing it out, then moving it downstream and down bay to some of the commercial facilities, down facility, for them to finish off, and utilize it in that way. So if you think about the combination of all that, you would have some type of filtering here, you would have source interdiction and decreased nitrogen here with the alternative septic systems and potentially horse farm addressing. You would have, again, another 50% knock here at Mill Pond, and you'd finish it off with some polishing with filtering down at Warren's Cove. The thought process is that as an entire system would be effective, and hopefully something where we can then prove to DEP we are gaining these kinds of results from that. Barnstable Clean Water Coalition's already doing measuring of what's currently in the river for background, so that when these things start to go in, we have something to compare to. Plan summary. So what you're looking at here is the watersheds, the number of parcels that the plan calls for that need to be connected by a traditional means within that watershed, the amount of nitrogen that will be the total resulting removal of nitrogen on a kilogram per day basis, and then the same thing on a kilogram per year basis. For those of you in Lewis Creek, you'll notice this does include the Stewart's Creek project, because Stewart's Creek came in after the sampling happened that established the limits for Lewis Creek. So that is part of this plan. What is not in this is the non-traditionals, as I mentioned, and the fact that we're also seriously considering, for a number of reasons, putting a denitrification filter on the treatment plant and the results of that and how that will incorporate it. If you want to look at it by stages, this is here. This table is particularly important for us for DEP to show them that even though we're doing this over 3 phases, we are not in any way, shape, or form reneging on our commitments, that actually the vast majority is being taken out in the first phase, another big chunk in the second phase, and a very little bit left, or not a little bit, but a relatively smaller amount being taken out in the third phase. Same information is below for the stages if you're interested in the stages. Finances. I will go back to my caveat from the beginning. I am an engineer. I'm not the financial person. If you want a very in-depth discussion on the financial piece, I highly recommend you go watch Mark Milne's discussion with Town Council that occurred on October 3rd. You can go on the town's website. You can go watch Town Council meetings there. You can even go by chapter, so you don't have to watch the whole meeting. You can just see that I can talk if I try. Specific part. It is a very in-depth discussion. I will do my best to sort of relay some of the big picture concepts to that. That's really where you need to go, though, to get an in-depth look. So if you look at the plan and you look at the different aspects of the plan listed here, the total cost is estimated to be slightly north of $1 billion. What this chart shows you is that though the plan is a 30-year construction plan, it is a 50-year financing plan, because the last bonds are issued on the 30th year. They're 20-year bonds. They won't come mature to the 50th year. 30 years of construction, 50 years of financial activity. There's a number of funding sources that they are looking at to try to make up that $1 billion. And at this point, I will tell you that what's been said in Town Council, and I'll repeat it here, is that for this next year, the expectation of Town Manager and Mark Milne which is the finance director, is to have a long-running conversation with town council working this issue. This is not a fully baked yet. This is now going through the process, and there's 2 sheets of issues that need to be discussed, and I'll show them to you briefly in a minute, where town council needs to have a robust discussion about choices it has to make and policies it needs to implement in order to figure out how it wants to do this. A proposal from Mark to them for consideration is this one, where he would break it out like this, with different contributions here coming from different sources that you can see listed here, and the final amount here at 100%. Now, as I mentioned, Mark has brought forth to town council, and the town manager has forwarded this, a number of issues that they need to think through as in light of this and try to decide which will inform this financial model. I'm not going to read these to you because I probably couldn't explain many of them to you because I'm not a finance guy. But what I will do is I'll let you take a look at them. And again, this is more just to try to give you the sense of they're about to embark on a 1-year conversation about finances. If that is something that's important to you, there's an opportunity for you to engage with your town councilor and be part of that process and part of that discussion. Implementation. So this is phase 1, years 0 to 10 of the project. What you're looking at is multiple colors. Each color represents what we consider a project boundary. The way this plan gets implemented through town council is, as we were talking earlier this evening before the presentation started, is via CIPs, capital improvement projects. Those of you that know the town's budgeting process, there's the capital improvement project side and the ops budget side. The capital improvement project happens as a means to try to bring forward things that are greater than $50,000 that happen in short confined periods, 3 years generally, and work through as projects. These will all come to town council in that mechanism. They will get preliminary design, final design, and come to town council for monies to be able to do the construction piece of that. This is how they're all going to break out. You will notice that there's about 20 projects in about 10 years. There will be a lot of construction in the community. There's a lot that's going to be going on, and we have not yet figured out, or we're continuing to work on, how best to sequence this to try to keep the pain to a minimum for any one human being, i.e., you don't want to have construction in front of your house for 3 and 4 consecutive seasons. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. So we are continuing to work on how the best this works out. What you'll notice is this 100% means we've achieved 44% because this is only phase 1 of the plan. The ones that are funded, the projects that you see in red here are the ones that at least have some preliminary or final design monies. The projects in pink don't. Now, these slides are meant to sort of speak to a myth. Prior to coming to the town, I was a consultant for a number of years, working with communities. And as a consultant, you would traditionally go into a community, you would come up with a plan, you'd present it to their decision makers for about 40 minutes. They'd have about 20 minutes to ask you questions about it. They'd look at it, they'd get intimidated by it, they'd put it on a shelf, and they wouldn't do anything with it. That's happened a lot. You don't have to look too far beyond our borders to see communities that have plans in place that they're not able to move on. This town council is completely opposite of that. This town council has aggressively been moving on this since 2017. The plan was presented to them in August of 2017. Town council vice president at the time then came to us immediately and said, okay, that's good. Let's start seeing some projects. We want to start to implement. How can we start moving this along? And what you'll see over the next couple of slides, and I won't read them all to you, is somewhere on the order of $22 million of work that has already been appropriated by town council to start to get after this issue. Again, I say this because this is not a council to date that has been hesitant about trying to affect the community in a positive way regarding nutrients or implement this plan. They are actively moving forward with it as we speak. And again, there's a number of pages of this. And that brings us to next step. So we are continuing this dialogue. We've had conversations in a number of villages. We're going to continue to do that to try to make sure we can bring this word as far as we can bring it. There's other means of public interaction that are also happening, public outreach that are also happening. In the meantime, we are collecting comments on the draft CWMP. That will get submitted to DEP and Cape Cod Commission and eventually the MEPA process, hopefully in about a month's time. We've had an outside consultant firm look at it and do a value engineering. In fact, we just got that back today. We've had SMAS model it and look at the modeling to make sure that it's going to be effective. We've gotten preliminary results back from them showing that it is. And then we're going to keep pressing forward. As I mentioned, this town council has been very aggressive and been working very hard at this issue, and we have been preliminarily designing some of those early projects and early plans to try to be ready to move very quickly. And with that, questions? And remember, we have to get the mic. You guys have been a very quiet crowd. Last night I got beat up for like the whole thing. What can I answer for you? Yes, ma'am.
Who is or what department is responsible for the maintenance of town property, and what might be done before, in conjunction with this project, as far as the town use of fertilizer, and I don't even want to get into Roundup, but it's fertilizer.
So both answers are us. So we as DPW are the spearhead on the CWMP plan that you just saw. We also are the department that's responsible for maintenance of town properties. So the conversation's happening internal to us. So to try to work on fertilizer usage and stuff like that. As I said, much of our department, particularly our cemeteries department, has been very proactive in this issue, has been leaning way forward in terms of organic substitutes for things like Roundup, and looking at organic uses for fertilizers, but the conversation will have to continue. So, but all that reigns within our house. Yes, ma'am.
The state of Commonwealth has a $1 billion, excess for the last 2 years. Could we receive any money from that?
We could ask. I mean, again, that's a political process, and they'd have to go up and find a way to do it. The way the state traditionally contributes to these projects is via their state revolving loan fund, and then principal forgiveness within that state revolving loan fund. The problem that we're anticipating, though it's not been told to us, it's just us anticipating, is that at this scale, that is a lot, that will overwhelm that fund. When you're talking $1 billion, that is a significant, obviously, amount of money and stuff. So, but that is the way that they've traditionally in the past contributed to these types of projects. However, that said, the Cape Cod Commission, I know, has been working this issue too, on both state and federal levels, because this is a Cape-wide issue. And all communities in the Cape are wrestling with similar numbers and similar issues to this. And so I know there's been some discussion from their perspective in terms of trying to find some sort of financial grant relief and things of that nature. At this point in time, since Mark can't put his hands on that, he's had to create the plan, the financial plan, based on things that he's sure he can access and deal with.
Wastewater would benefit the whole state because many people come down to the Cape
Agreed.
on their vacations.
No argument. Other questions? Yes, sir. Over here.
A major sink of nitrogen is the sediment of water bodies. How would you reduce the nitrogen there?
So in the areas that we're dredging, that's part of the consideration. I didn't bring it up here, but that's part of the consideration there. The areas that we're not dredging, there's at least some discussion about, will there be, if we do dredge further downstream, is there natural flushing that removes some of that anyways? And if not, do we have to go back and look at that at some point? Follow up.
I just caught it quickly, but was 44% of that funding coming from like a sales and room tax or something like that? It seemed like a very big chunk of the apple, and just wondering where that money was now going, or is that a new tax? Lowest one
Rooms and
there.
meal tax. So, again, go watch Mark's presentation, because I'm on thin ice here. My understanding of that is when that came forward, and Dan, jump on me if I go the wrong way with this. When that came forward, they had the foresight to set up ahead of time a certain percentage of that into an account that was for that, basically for this usage only. I believe that's that, correct? So the answer that Dan gave was that was the existing rooms and meals tax, which has been a number of places, which I just talked about, plus the new short-term rental tax and coming from those revenue sources.
We've had local options rooms tax for a number of years, and I don't remember how many years ago, was it 2011 maybe, where we were able to add additional local options, each community, and it's when the meals tax, we were able to add a local options meals tax, because for a long time it was only the state meals tax that was allowed to be collected. So when those two additional local options meals tax came in and the town voted to use them, that's when that this fund was established. The short-term rental tax is only been collected, I think they started collecting in July 1st of this year. It's something that was put in by the Commonwealth last December.
But if you go watch Mark's October 3rd presentation, he has some projections to that, much smarter than I am at any rate, about all of this stuff.
Okay, yeah, it just seemed like a big chunk there, and I was wondering if that was coming out of general revenue, and so we had to make it up some other manner to balance the books.
Now,
Or is
general
this
revenue is
kinda
this
like
piece right here.
But the, you know, if we're already spending that, or this part of the general spending, you know, what's going to make up the difference? But sounds like a good chunk of it's new and kind of dedicated, which is good.
Other questions? Wow, you guys are a quiet group. All right, well, if there aren't, yes, sir.
Kind of talk tail end of this as well, but is the existing sewer treatment plant being expanded, or is there enough capacity there, or have you tried to jump into like permitting like sewer outfall pipe, like a lot of major metropolitan areas?
So a couple different questions there. Let me sort of take them one at a time. So the existing sewer treatment facility has the ultimate room for expansion to be able to treat everything we've envisioned as part of this. There's a couple thresholds that are going to need to happen on it for treatment reasonably quickly within phase one, principally aeration expansion, but it has the room to treat. There is a discussion that has to happen about effluent capacity, the ability to dispose of. Remember we talked about there's treatment and disposal? That's different. And we're going to be much more limited initially in terms of effluent disposal there. In fact, we're just getting some results back from a study that's going on right now from CDM Smith, looking at that very issue and looking at issues and mitigating factors that could be done to try to expand that as much as possible. And then, what other options are there? What the town has already done is we've started to look at those ourselves. So for instance, that JBCC discussion, you might not have been here, we talked earlier about Joint Base Cape Cod and its plant. One of the things that's attractive about that is it has effluent disposal capacity potentially there. The other thing that we are working on actively currently is the town of Yarmouth. The town of Yarmouth has, for its western side wastewater solutions, doesn't have a treatment facility. They don't really want to build a treatment facility. What they do have is effluent disposal capacity. We, on the other hand, have a treatment facility and have the ability to expand that treatment facility. We don't have necessarily the effluent disposal capacity. So there's the beginning of a technical conversation, and it'll eventually morph into a political and financial conversation between the two communities to see if there's a synergy there where we could take their wastewater flow, treat it, send it back, and in addition, send some of ours to them that they could dispose of for us. Additionally to that, there's other solutions that are being looked at, but it's too preliminary to talk about. Ocean outfall may be in that discussion, may not be in that discussion. But right now, we're really sort of waiting to get the final results from the consultant in terms of what that plant can really do, what the risk factors are, what's the mitigating factors to that. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Yes, sir.
So Chuck and I both, we do a lot of these septic upgrades, and I'm looking at the Long Beach Short Beach is in phase one. And so if you were a betting man, when would we be able to connect up to that? Because, you know, the difference is, do we put in an expensive septic system now, or do we put in a tight tank and wait if it's gonna be 9 or 10 years? And that's a pretty good bet. I mean, we might go to the tight tank. Any initial thoughts on that?
So Griffin's looking it up now. If you look in the CWMP, there's a big fold-out sheet that he's looking at right now that sort of sequence timing-wise when all those projects are going to be. He's actually going to speak to Board of Health tomorrow, not Board of Health, excuse me, the Health Department tomorrow to make sure that they have some plan on that timing, but what's the number? 5 years.
So it's reasonably certain within 5 years, it would be your guess, at least start of construction? Okay.
Now, but again, all those are going to have to go via CIP to town council, so they have an opportunity at any point in time to go a different direction if they so choose. They maintain the control over this plan. It never runs away from them.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep. Yes, ma'am. Oh, no, wait for it. You're getting Fitbit points.
You mentioned the Cape Vineyard winds, and then we know they're going to be running their cable up Strawberry Hill Road, and the town is going to say, hey, we're putting in sewer along that road. Will you be doing it at the same time that they're running the cable?
Yes.
And at
So,
what?
so the question is, in case you didn't hear it, is when Vineyard Wind goes in, are we going to put sewer in at the same time as Vineyard Wind? The answer is yes. 2 reasons. One, we want to leverage their paving to make sure that their paving effort covers our pipe. But 2, and almost more importantly, what they're installing is a big duct bank right up the road. It will be very difficult for us to work around that and deal with that if we try to put sewer in after the fact. If they go in simultaneously or sewer goes in slightly ahead of time, then it's sort of pre-coordinated, if that makes sense. So we need to go with them on that. The expectation is that that will start next fall at this point. It got pushed a year. So now it's next fall that will start, and we'll start doing that activity.
And then once that's in, the roads or houses that are connecting off that Strawberry Hill system, is that going to be ongoing as soon as they get that in the road on Strawberry Hill?
So that's a discussion that's happening at the town council level to decide how they want to deal with the sort of 200 to 300 homes that are immediately adjacent to that project versus all the homes that could ultimately connect into that project. Which homes will be connecting and which is not. Were I a betting man, I would bet that the adjacent homes would be allowed to connect in, but again, there's some policy discussions that are going to happen along the way for that to be enabled.
Thank you.
Yep.
With the tragic loss of our president of the town council, do you see the town council changing at all? You said they're very proactive right now.
So I would hope not. We currently, well, there's 2 issues. One, Jim's passing is a huge loss, but there's also an election. And so there's a number of councilors that are up that are running against people and are opposed. So that could change the flavor of the council. If that is something that concerns people, then I would encourage you to be involved in that election. Find candidates that are in your precincts that are supportive of the plan and be supportive of them in that process, and then stay supportive of them. If you watch the discussion on Centerville Main Street that happened, you saw Councilor Biedenbender really have to stand firm on that plan. And really, I mean, you want to talk about political courage, and really show real courage in terms of trying to be supportive of this plan and what needs to happen with it. That's not easy. And it needs people to be supportive of her in the process of doing it, and people like her. So yes, there's potential that it could go the other way, so I would encourage people that are interested in this to be supportive of your town councilors and their decisions.
Thank
you. Yep.
This in some ways is a follow-up to that last question. Could you outline what the communication plan is moving on from here? I'm really quite surprised that there's so few people here tonight. I have to believe that there are going to be future spikes in interest in this thing.
Yeah.
Well, for example, will this presentation itself be available? The charts themselves, or the video will they?
So the plan is available. The person sitting to your right there, As community services director, also as the communications director for the town. And we've been working very closely with Lynn on how to do that. Channel 18 is trying to work up some products that could not only be sort of documentary in flavor that would sort of encapsulate this that somebody could watch, but also could be snippeted out into 1 to 2 minute little bites that can be dealt with sort of from a Facebook consuming public that only has time to sort of click on a 1 or 2 minute little bite, but hopefully from then we'll start to get an impression of what's going on. We have said that we will go talk to any group that wants to hear us, regardless of size and scale, about this plan. We've leveraged the best we can. I mean, you probably saw the Cape Cod Times with above fold $1 billion wastewater plan. I mean, that got some attention to people. And we are continuing in any mechanism that we can to have this conversation with folks. And that will continue even after the plan goes off to regulators, because the entire implementation of this is going to require us to have a running dialogue with the community, because it's not going to be easy. I mean, financially it's difficult, but just in terms of construction, it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of construction that will potentially be happening, and those of you that lived either in the Marston's Mills area or the C Street area, where we've had, relative to this, smaller projects going on, but know that the level of disturbance that caused and the level of consternation that caused, there's going to be a lot of construction work associated with this, and we're going to have a running conversation in the community about how to deal with that.
The red area that you showed on a later map that said this is the first area that is funded, and then there was another area that was part of the red, that one.
Yes.
That was not funded. When do you expect the pink areas to be funded, and do you have an idea of where that funding would come from at this point?
So as I said, all of these are projects. So what you've seen here are projects, that have already gone through to be funded. And the way all of this is going to be digested by town council is as projects. So for instance, there is a project coming right here that's going to be part of this year's CIP cycle. This has already been funded for design, this has been funded for design, this has been funded for design and construction. You kind of see a westward march starting to happen because the existing sewer system is right here. So these are all going on. The expectation is, and Griffin pulled that chart out a few minutes ago, that as we continue to understand how we want to implement this from a construction perspective, we will be bringing projects forward by each CIP cycle that will continue to do that, and town council will be approving that. Did I answer your question, or did I just get around it?
Well, it was a little over my head.
Okay, what part did I over your head on? Let's go back. I don't want to do that.
Well, first off, the map I was looking at was the one that was just red and pink, that one.
That one,
Just
yep.
red and pink.
Yep.
And these were all part of the phase 1, the first 10 years.
Everything that's shaded is part of phase 1.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was concerned because I live in the pink area,
Mhm.
and I'm asking about the funding about that. And I wanted to know, was there already a source of funding? I'm assuming the red area has to do with Vineyard Wind. That's where that funding
Not
is coming
exclusively.
from?
The Vineyard Wind, excuse me. That's why I went back to this. Vineyard Wind is this purple, well, I don't know what color this is, this mauve area.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm not a color guy.
Yeah, purple's fine.
Purple, this purple area, that's Vineyard Wind. This is the Finney's Lane project, which is sort of the area around Vineyard Wind, if you want to call it that. This is the Long Pond project. This will be the Route 28 pump station project, which will bring the force main all the way back to the plant, which is really sort of the main piece of infrastructure that's going to allow all of this to happen. So that's all those. So to your point, so like for instance, let's take this project right here. This one hasn't been funded yet. That will come probably in a year or 2 years. Right here, sort of the Great Marsh. So like 2 years from now, that would go to town council as a capital improvements project for them to fund. They have some monies based on the fact that they have the rooms and meals tax that they said that they've already been collecting monies for. So they have a small pot of money relative to the whole plan that they've been utilizing for some of this early work. However, they within that year have got to come up with how they're going to do that funding equation, because eventually it's got to come from all of that. Am I getting there now?
Well, I live in the green area.
up in here.
Right.
Yep.
How does that fit in?
So Huckins Neck is probably year. One moment, please. We're looking at the chart for those of our viewing audience at home.
Just speak a little louder.
So what he said is the first request for design money will happen 3 years from now. So we will go to town council in 3 years' time and say, we want preliminary design money for the Huckins Neck area. Now, preliminary design and design will probably take 2 years to get through for us to be able to get the thing preliminary designed and then designed. And then at that point in time, we'll go back to town council and say, we want construction money. So now talking 5 years out, 6 years out. And so that will go to town council and they'll ask, and at that point in time, they've got to come up with how they're doing their funding for that area to know how that's going to work.
Prior to that, I remember Huckins Neck talking about the route looked like the Route 28 corridor there. Route 28 corridor down, further down?
Right. This is Huckins Neck up in here, right?
Right, that's correct.
Yep.
But prior to discussion of Huckins Neck, you were talking about the dark purple area, which I believe is Long Pond, that area there.
That's the Long Pond project.
Yeah, and Route 28. And so that area would be sewered before Huckins Neck. Is that how my understanding is?
So what the plan is now is this is going to happen immediately because of the enabling of Vineyard Wind. This is then going to happen probably next. Because this is the pump station that enables all of this and all of this to be able to happen. And also happen everything out west. So that'll put a pump station in there, it'll gravity sewer the north side of Long Pond and bring a force main back to the treatment facility. After that point, we start getting into discussions about what's the next logical piece to start to try to piece through. The plan's taking a shot at it, but as we learn as we go, we may find that, hey, we're better off immediately jumping on Finney's Lane, or no, we're better off doing Long Pond, or we're better off continuing out Route 28. That's a discussion that's going to be happening. Part of what that will feed into is the discussion that happened earlier on the treatment plant. Is the treatment plant yet ready to accept those neighborhoods, or are we just getting backbones in initially while the treatment plant gets to where it needs to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see it a little better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, well, not hearing any, thank you all for coming. I do appreciate it. You guys have been a great crowd, very quiet. And I appreciate that too after last night. So thank you all for coming. I hope you have a nice evening. If you have questions on this, please feel free to come up and talk to Griffin and I afterwards. We're happy to stay here and talk to you. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.